They told us the missing Apollo footage burned in a warehouse fire. That's the official story. Smoke, heat, insurance. The tape canisters bulged, the reels warped, the acetate fused into a brown, bitter candy that no one could taste without choking. But that isn't how those minutes vanished. We didn't lose them. We hid them. Because when we synced the reel with the telemetry and listened, really listened, the moon answered back. Not with radio, not with reflected light, with a sound I have never heard on Earth, a sound like a door thinking about opening. You can stop listening any time if that helps. I won't. You asked me once, off camera, why I left flight operations the week before Artemis II's rehearsal burn. You saw how my hands shook around coffee cups, how I kept my thumb tucked on the inside of my palm like I was afraid it might point at something only I could see. This is the reason. Not scandal, not politics. A door. The only door that matters. I'll tell it the way it happened, in the order a human brain can keep breathing through. I was born into static. Americans of a certain age say they remember their fathers holding rabbit ear antennas, their mothers shushing everyone in the living room because the image was grainy and Neil's voice was thin. In our house, the rabbit ears were parabolic and 40 meters wide. My earliest memory is the white tension lines on the goldstone dish, the way they hummed when the desert wind crossed the cables, the sun burning through my closed eyelids while my father stood with his back to me, watching the azimuth tick across a strip of paper. He hated boys' baseball, noise, and people who talked over loops. He loved two things: signal and the clear, unambiguous machinery that captured it. When he died, he left me a cardboard box. Inside were ordinary things: a slide rule browned with oil, a pocket notebook that smelled like pencil lead, a strip of Captain tape stuck to a page like a pressed leaf, a Polaroid of men with haircuts and sideburns standing under a telescope dome with their hands on their hips. At the bottom, under a folded handkerchief, was a reel, 16mm of film in a stainless case. Tranquility, he'd written in a careful engineer's hand. And a 7-inch reel of magnetic tape labeled with a 4-digit number, a month, and the word AUX. I'm not a romantic. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm a systems engineer who aged into a mission interface role because I could translate between the near-religious language of propulsion and the poor grammar of politics without losing temper. I did my graduate work in cryo-vibrations and gimbal drift. Later, Antarctica. South Pole season with the ice cube people, chasing neutrinos that never once acknowledged us. After that, JPL, a postdoc whose background was basically listening for impossible things. I took the box to my garage and forgot about it for 3 years. When the videos began circulating, grainy rectangles of Apollo frames enhanced until the seams and the Hasselblad emulsion were visible, armchair archivists pointing to anomalies, the way the shadow of the flagpole trembled. You remember the culture war that woke up. It wasn't the first time. Where's the missing telemetry? The dull drumbeat went, like it had in every decade since the last Saturn V flared and went out. A senator waved a binder of FOIA requests on television. There were the usual cranks and the rare patient scholar. And then the odd thing, the James Webb Telescope discovery chatter bleeding into it. If JWST can see to the edge of time, the cheap commentators said, why can't it find a crisp shot of the Apollo sites? You and I know why. You can't point that thing at the moon, it would blind her instruments, and the geometry of L2 is all wrong for lunar tourist snapshots. But the internet does not live on facts. It lives on the friction between them. I was in Pasadena when the first little thing happened. An intern with a musician's ear heard a beat in LRO Doppler residuals. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter sometimes sounds like a kettle cooling after a song, a slip and settle as the moon's gravity tells her what's what. But there was a modulation, repeating every 6 hours independent of orbit, not correlated with temperature or tide. She asked me because I had a reputation for tolerating questions that lay sideways to budget. It sounded like a breath held too long. I thought about the box. At night, in my garage, I threaded the 16mm on a Bolex that my father once used to film payloads leaving the desert. The film was silent, flecked with dust that threw up ghosts every time the frame jumped. Not the first steps. Those were archived and digitized and remastered into history. From the angle and the lens, I could tell it was the auxiliary camera mounted inside the LM, pointed down the ladder. The shot no one shows because it's too ordinary. A great man's boots on a metal ladder, the rectangle of sunlight hovering in the hatch like a mouth. Then, and this was wrong, the camera, as if on its own, tilts. To the right, to the ground, to a patch of regolith where, in the blown-out exposure to lunar day, there is a darker ring no one ever remarked. I wound back. The magnetic tape. I aligned with a Tascam I bought for a band that never formed. AUX. Auxiliary channel. Not the main downlink, not voice, not biomedical. AUX was... what? It shouldn't be audio at all. It should be an electrical logging track. A multimeter on film. I'm saying this the long way because it deserves the dignity of friction. I synced the reel to the tape using my father's notation. The white chinograph he'd scratched along the bottom of the can, and that matched a tick he'd drawn on the paper leader. And when the white boot appears in the frame, and the rectangle of the hatch sharpens, and the camera tilts, as if a hand unseen has twisted it, the tape sings. No voice. A tone that is not a tone, the shape of a chord inside a machine. I don't have a better word than key. When I played it the third time, the house shuddered. The lights at the end of my street in Altadena fluttered. A motion sensor in my neighbor's yard clicked. My phone, asleep, woke without ringing and showed me a push notification from a South Pole Slack I hadn't muted in years. A friend still at Ice Cube had typed, mostly to himself, "Weird coincidence. Low energy cascade at a lunar angle again and again. Any solar weirdness?" And then, under that, "Why do I feel like I can hear it?" I took the reel to the lab the next day. I wasn't careful enough about it. The problem with secrets is that they know how to smell their way home. Within a week, the room had grown populated with polite people whose lanyards didn't match their shoes. One of them never gave me a card, never took a chair. He stood and asked questions like he wasn't a person at all, but an echo. He said White Sands instead of Edwards. He said Nevada Test and Training Range, but he meant Area 51 and wanted me to flinch. "What do you think it is?" he asked, when we played the synced loop for him, and the tone came and went, rough, like a throat clear. "A coupling artifact between the film and a power transformer," I said. "Tell me what you think it is," he said again. "Here's what I think now. The moon keeps memories differently than rocks should, and Apollo left a fingerprint not on dust, but on a door that was waiting for someone to touch it the right way. The way you touch a sleeping child's shoulder so they rise gently instead of bolt upright. But back then I said none of that. I nodded at the safe answer and carefully shut the Bolex. He left. He came back 2 days later with a case. In the case was a crystal, black as wet ink, cut in a way that made my eyes water if I looked at it too long. Selenium from the Sea of Tranquility, a sliver embedded in resin, labeled, inventoried with witnesses, a clerk, a whole tree of signatures that traced back to a forgotten Capcom's initials. "We want to test an entanglement protocol," the man who didn't sit said. "It's real light touch." He put the crystal under a mount and brought up a device that looked like a microscope mated with a harpsichord. "We call it an Area 51 experiment," someone joked, too loudly. "We send one word," the man said, "a word that isn't word but phase, amplitude, and rhythm combined." He tapped the can of film. "We send what this sends when you play it. We don't think it's audio. We think it's instruction." I said no. Then I said yes, Because the thing engineers do when faced with someone else's lunacy is build the safety cage around it and drive the forklift themselves. We pulsed the crystal while the film ran and the key things sang, and 5 things happened. At Goldstone, the dish's shadow seemed to shift a half-inch in the desert wind despite no wind at all. And an old technician who had taught my father, now a museum volunteer, said out loud to a child, "Do you feel that? Like your feet are less sure than they were?" At the South Pole, Ice Cube recorded a whisper of something that looked like a neutrino decided to be late. On a mountain in Hawaii, a radio telescope logged a hiss against the terminator of the moon, as if the night part exhaled. In a clean room in Houston, a tiny mass spectrometer registered a slope in the helium-3 off-gassing from old Apollo sample vials, an exhale that did not match temperature or pressure or time. And in my lab, the crystal cracked. Not the resin, not the optical mount, but the sliver itself, like a tuning fork struck too true. They took the broken halves and left me alone long enough to miss them. And when they returned, they were smiling. "We're going south," the man said. "Florida?" I said. "South," he said again. "Bottom of the world." You've seen the tourist stations, McMurdo's Rust, the cheerful C-17s that step down from Christchurch, the way all human life gathers into boxes and then into tunnels to hide from a cold that isn't weather but the absence of kindness. This wasn't that. This was a strip of pressure ridge 100 clicks from the pole, a quake-scored ridge in the ice where the wind had filed the surface into honed blades. The only things that break the white horizon there are sastrugi, flags, and the occasional bad idea. We had all 3. They called it Concordia Sublevel, but it wasn't under Concordia. The name was misdirection. Names always are. A bulldozed trench. A prefab that looked like any other prefab until you noticed that its bolts are single-use and its seams are welded not for weather but for secrecy. And then a tunnel with a heat line and a rope line and no other markers for 50 meters. And then, this is what made me forget my own name for a minute, a door in the ice that was not ice. It was black, like the crystal we coaxed into breaking. And when the headlamps crossed it, the light pooled and then slid away, as if it were oily, as if the black were the color of refusal. "Found it with a gravimeter," said the man casually, like we were at a lecture. "Repeated anomalies. The ice here is wrong. Layers, but resonant. When you hit it with the right beat, it conducts." "The right beat," I said. "The word," he said. Under the ice, embedded like a tooth in gum, the door was dodecagonal, 12 sides, like someone wanted a clock but didn't trust time to mean only one thing. Lines etched into it were not writing, unless you consider music writing in geometry, which now I do. We brought the Bolex. We brought the tape. We brought a device from Nevada that spun photons like they were silk from a spider we had tamed. We played the film, and the moon breathed under my boots. The ice flexed. Old bubbles, trapped when mammoths had hair, rose, elongated, and slid sideways with childish popping. The tone came. It is funny to say tone, when what I felt was how you feel when someone you thought hated you says your name exactly right for the first time in your life. The dodecagon listened. It didn't open. We tried 3 times. We went back north, Pasadena, a briefing room with coffee too bitter to be an accident, a screen that showed the rough edges of the Mare Tranquillitatis, like the rim of a broken cup. The man said, "There's another one upstairs." He meant it. There was a twin. Not in Antarctica, not on Earth. The signal in the LRO residuals grew teeth, and when a private company's tiny orbiter dragged a camera low across a region the public thinks it knows too well to hide anything, there it was, a humped symmetry under a thin cover of dust, ringed by a darkness like oil. You could have stood there in 1969 and not seen it if you didn't let the camera tilt. They told us things. They used the phrase Antarctica Secret Base like a trigger and watched my pupils. They showed us the footage that's missing. Of course there's missing footage. Even clean rooms shed dust. The missing minutes were not hundreds of feet of film unspooled in a hiss. There are a few precise seconds where the auxiliary camera's handler, who, no one ever owns that action in the transcripts, turns and sets the frame in a way that is not human intention, but very much human curiosity. The rectangle window in the LM door like a mouth, the ladder, the boot, the tilt, and the dark ring under the dust, a halo around a geometry we pretend is random. And then, stutter. A lurch not in gravity but in stance, like the moon shifted its weight. "We think Artemis won't need to land there," the man said, "but she ought to." "Why me?" I asked. "Because you listen," he said, "and because you think about the ice when you hear a song. Because you understand that neutrinos and secrets both pass through everything like it isn't there." There was another reason. 6 months earlier, the asteroid atlas, the one the public calls Atlas because of a catalog number, not because there was a plan to let it hold the sky, had not only been more interesting than we'd told anyone, but had done something we had not predicted. You saw the headlines. You remember the panic that refused to admit it was panic. Asteroid Atlas impact unlikely, NASA said, and then actually meant it because in the last week of observation, the orbital elements drifted as if a hand had touched them. Not deflected, retuned. The change was not consistent with outgassing or a crater ejecta event. It was consistent with someone singing to a stone. That's when the James Webb rumor mill lit up. Someone from that team, older than me, meaner, with the lovable anger of a man who works in wavelengths and understands light better than any painter, told me over a bad sandwich that Webb had seen a non-thermal anomaly in the mid-infrared signature of Atlas. "A shadow where the sun couldn't cast one," he said, "like a halo that refuses to glow." He didn't send me a plot. He didn't have to. He used the phrase James Webb Telescope Discovery out loud in a hallway like it was a warding chant. Signals breed signals. We went abnormally fast. I can't tell you all the places we refueled. I can tell you that when you ride inside a pressurized tank that used to be a cargo hold and now is a craft, the air smells like paint, fear, and helium. That the moon from orbit is not romantic. It's the inside of a lung that forgot how to expand. Everywhere, scars. We didn't go down in tranquility. We went to the adjacent dark. You've watched enough helmet cams to know the rhythms. The fast breath early, the way some astronauts grunt without meaning to, the counting that is not counting but a human ward against the oldest superstition we have. Silence. We stepped into 1/6 Earth and I hated my legs immediately. You're too strong. You can jump too far. The dust betrays you. It rises a little, falls slow and never forgets where you've been. The structure was less than a dozen steps from the mapped boulders everyone uses to orient that old scene. A bulge under the powder, like a rib. The dodecagon was not patchwork or chunk. It was skin. Skin that refused heat. Skin that tasted like dusk on my tongue when I stuck it out into my helmet's stale air and imagined touching the black with spit. We installed the device from Nevada. We anchored 3 little pucks around the polygon's perimeter, each one a mix of fiber, diamond, and arrogance. We clicked on a battery that would have kept a hospital alive for a weekend. We set the Bolex in a little shrine we'd built into the armature. A laughable, sentimental decision I took because the first ritual worked and God help me, I was superstitious. We pulled tape over tape. We spun photons into phase and amplitude. We said the word. The moon taught us patience. Once, in the South Pole winter, a man I didn't like stared through a porthole for 6 hours until the ridge gave up its secret. A flag someone had left there 5 years before that had been wind-sanded into a blade. It wasn't going to show all at once, he said, with a stubborn joy. That's what the door did. It didn't open exactly. It thinned. The black changed from refusal to clarity. And there were stars inside where rock should be, not stars in space. Stars under your feet. Stars in layers like you were looking through polished glass at the backs of other rooms. The tone rose. It wasn't loud. It was precise. It said, I know you. Then it said, do you know you? After you've bent your life around Newton for long enough, it's humiliating to admit you felt a second gravity. It didn't pull me sideways, it pulled me inward. My mind, that's the word we use when we have no good instrument, my mind was not overrun by voices or visions. It was focused. Imagine the most expensive microscope in the world clicks into a resolution you didn't know it could reach. Now imagine the subject is the structure of your own hope. The door did that. Under my boots, geometry arranged itself. Not an alphabet again, but chords of length. How do I write this? The dodecagon taught me a language without time, and I am hammering it into minutes on your screen. Forgive the wobble. Behind the door, the moon keeps an archive. Not of artifacts, not of species, of possibilities. Earth's history is not just what happened, but what very nearly did. Every storm that didn't form, every extinction that missed by an hour, every hand that almost reached for a hand and then didn't and left a child alone, that data doesn't evaporate. It diffracts. The moon collects the interference pattern. The door opens when we play ourselves back with enough fidelity to recognize the rhythm. That's why the missing footage mattered. Apollo wasn't a key. Apollo was a mirror we accidentally held at the right angle. They tilted that auxiliary camera, whoever they were, and the moon saw us see it. The tape recorded the shape of our looking, and the dodecagon registered the phase of that astonishment. You can't fake astonishment. It has the same fingerprint in every language. You want science? Fine. The black material is a metamaterial organized at a scale that is to graphene what graphene is to burlap. It drinks photons from a narrow band and refuses to give them back until you curve the metric of the space just so. We used entanglement because we had to, because the door isn't located entirely in the coordinates where my body stood. It's located partly in the relationship between events. Area 51 didn't invent the trick. They found the instruction manual in a crystal we'd brought back when we were too arrogant to think we could learn anything new. We stepped through. No one writes that sentence honestly. You don't step through. Your brain bargains with it. It says, this is a hatch. It says, pressure differential, prepare. But there's no pressure in a relationship. There is only continuity or rupture, and the door offered us the first while threatening to teach the second to anyone who lied to it. Inside, there was not a chamber. Inside was, God forgive me, clouds, not water. Probability, dense like fog, speckled with glints. Each one a track you could follow if you were willing to unlatch your own eyes. I chose one track. We all did it differently. Mine felt like going home. I saw a child standing under a dish, looking up while the steel hummed with wind in the desert. I saw my father touch the chinograph to stainless steel with a care I never showed him when he coughed. I saw a hand tilt a camera in a cabin the size of a closet while a boot hovered above dust. I saw an old ice flag become a blade. And I saw something that never happened. The asteroid Atlas's wake crossed the path of the Earth's magnetotail at a moment where, if it had, the aurora would have reached to Florida, and you would have known the shape of your shadow for the rest of your life. It didn't happen. The archive held the shape of it not happening. It also held the pressure wave that should have followed an impact that never arrived. I understood then why the atlases of the world sometimes move when we sing. The moon has been guarding us badly and beautifully for as long as there are patterns to gather. She doesn't shove. She hums. Sometimes we hum back the right way, sometimes we don't. My teammate, the intern with the musician's ear, began to cry. Her body stood, lamp bobbing. Her cry didn't fog her glass. It didn't fog anything. It sounded like admission. In her hands, the archive braided. She was watching a version of her mother that left, and a version that stayed, and the interference pattern that made my friend exist exactly as she is. She put her hand to the door's edge and let out the kind of laugh that is not joy and not grief, and breaks a person's ribs from the inside. I didn't say her name. The door doesn't like names. Names fix things. The door loves relationships, which are messier and true. We stayed inside as long as we could tolerate the idea that we are not alone in our choosing. Then we backed out. Then we ran. The dust fought us. The dust always tells you who you are. It grabbed our ankles like a child. On the comm, a voice in Houston that sounded like a clean room said, "We show you 2 meters east of Nominal." "We're leaving," I said. "Nominal." Then, in the audio analysis later, in the dips in the telemetered heartbeat of my suit, and in the LRO residuals, and in an anomalous long baseline interferometer ghost that no one will publish because we have left the part of science that has referees. There was a low note like a diesel engine rolling under ocean, like the hum of 100 beehives inside a skull. The door had accepted our visit. It had a gift. When we got home, 6 things happened. Goldstone's old man died. He went in his sleep with his hands loose, and I was grateful. And I stole 10 minutes before the funeral to go stand under that dish and listen to silence that wasn't. In Hawaii, the radio telescope picked up the same Terminator hiss, but this time it was modulated by our own song. We were in the recording. What an awful, beautiful humiliation to hear your own arrogance played back in space. At the South Pole, a cascade of neutrino-like events occurred not from the usual cosmic rays, but from the direction of the moon's underbelly, like the door had whispered through 2,200 meters of ice for the pleasure of hearing itself arrive late. In Houston, an irreplaceable helium-3 sample refused to off-gas in a way that contradicted what we knew about temperatures and patience, as if the vial was listening now, too. In Nevada, the entanglement device began to show a drift, a phase walk that meant we had impressed a new rhythm into an old crystal. We had taught a rock a swear word. And in Florida, a patch of air over the Atlantic shimmered, and a pilot on a training hop for a quiet agency tipped his wing on reflex because he thought he'd seen a sonic wave from a meteor. There was no meteor. There was the wake of what Atlas would have been if the door hadn't been singing to it for 1,000,000 years. We wrote none of that down. We talked in kitchens with faucets running and dishwashers on so the microphones in our walls would be bored. We told the truth like people confessing affairs they didn't have. So why leave? Why confess now to you? Because the door expects stewardship. It isn't a vault. It's a mind made of rock that understands impedance and mercy. We opened it. It opened us. And not all songs humans will sing are kind. I don't trust the men who never sit to be the only ones with the word. And because there's one more thing. I haven't said what I saw when I stepped in the second time. Alone. Yes, I went back alone. That's when you'd say, "Are you insane?" And I'd nod. I took the Bolex because ritual matters, because the problem with laboratories is that they make you forget candles were instruments before oscilloscopes were. I set the armature. I played the tape. I said the word. I stepped. Inside, I didn't watch my father, or Apollo, or Atlas. The pattern the door offered me was an ocean at the bottom of the world. Antarctica's bedrock, revealed in a melt I pray I never see. Along the coast, glacial eyes opened, black and curious. In one of them sat a structure that had learned to wear ice like clothing. Not ours, not human, old, patient. I saw a man, me, older by a dozen winters, kneel and put his hand to a black polygon there and whisper the same word we used on the moon. But this time, something answered in English. It said, "You took long enough." When I stumbled back, I had frost on my visor that shouldn't exist because the pressure was uniform and the humidity is math. The frost wrote a pattern like breath on glass. 12 small lines, a clock face with no hands. There's a line I haven't crossed with you tonight, but I will, and then I'll stop. We think in arrows. Then this, then that. The door thinks like a web. If you pull here and sing there, a thing that once chose you will choose again across years because what is a year to a geometry? The so-called missing footage only vanishes to the part of us that catalogs. It never vanishes to the part of us that listens. We bank that piece of astonishment in the archive without asking. The moon remembered it. She isn't an object. She's a lock that was waiting for us to mature into the courage to admit we don't need to break it. We need to speak to it like kin. You want me to put this in a headline before you cut it into your video and feed it to an algorithm that cannot taste? Fine. Apollo's missing footage was right. Area 51 experiment unlocked a lunar archive. James Webb Telescope discovery aligns with a shadow that isn't a shadow. Antarctica secret base holds the other key. Asteroid Atlas impact avoided because the moon sang first. Put the SEO in the copy. The algorithm doesn't care about wonder. Humans do. I left because the men who don't sit wanted to weaponize the door. Imagine predictive targeting, one of them said, almost kind. Imagine knowing which of a million futures is most likely and nudging it, softly. He was talking about bombs. I was thinking about children not dying as often. We weren't talking about the same thing. You can argue I'm a coward. I'll accept it. I will also accept that I have sat under a dish while it hummed, and under a continent while it kept its own counsel, and on a world that we think is dead, while it asked me if I was alive enough to meet it halfway. I can accept cowardice and still tell the truth. Here's the last thing. It will sound like madness because it is hope said without makeup. When we were packing out of Concordia sublevel, after the door had taught us to stutter, after we'd played ritual with film and tape and shame, I turned my headlamp off for one step. Just one. I wanted to know whether the dark would hold my hand. It did. Not absence, not the shape of fear. Presence, the hum in the ice. The thread that ran from the dish my father loved to the ribbon in Nevada, to the pucks on the moon, to the orbit of a stone that did not hit us, because something made of gravity and grace thought we were worth not dying that day. The door's not locked against us. It's locked with us. That's the paradox no one who writes history wants, that we keep the key by becoming the kind of thing that should not have one. I will go back. You knew that as soon as I started. I will take the Bolex and the auxiliary tape and the only word that ever mattered. The men who stand will come with, or they won't. The intern with the musician's ear will cry, or she won't. The door will open, or it won't. Atlas will listen, or the next stone will, and the one after that. Listen. At Goldstone, when you stand under the dish at night, you hear the desert talk in a dry whisper. It sounds like sand rehearsing the shape of wind that hasn't arrived yet. If you stand there long enough, you learn the difference between silence and attention. One is empty. The other is a room waiting for someone to enter it with unclenched hands. That's all the moon is. A room built of attention. A lock that opens to the shape of how we look at it. Lean close now. The rest of the world is loud with wrong words. Let me give you the only true thing I have. The one the door taught me when I forgot my name and found it again shaped like a cord. The universe is not held shut by force. It is held shut by a promise, and the promise is this. It opens for whatever loves it enough to listen.